I'm back now in studio with Colonel Jacques Neriah, the former deputy head of assessment for Israeli military intelligence. I'm also joined by Tom Gross, Middle East expert and journalist. Thanks so much. I'm going to start with you, Tom, first. Why is Israel being singled out by the ICJ? I mean, the conflicts all over the world. There's Russia, Ukraine, there's the Darfur. Why this?
Well, I mean, it's preposterous, isn't it? And in the end, it has to be anti-Semitism, or what I would even say, it's a kind of possibly subconscious Holocaust guilt. In other words, it was famously said the Germans will never forgive the Jews for Auschwitz. We could say the world will also never forgive the Jews for having actually been the prime victims of the worst genocide in human history. And therefore, if they can somehow portray Israel, the Jewish state, of somehow carrying out some kind of genocide, which is of course ridiculous, they can somehow alleviate their guilt, or they don't have to study the Holocaust anymore, or so on. But I'd also say that not only is Israel and Jews a victim of this evil act of accusing Israel of genocide, but everybody else who suffered from genocides, not just Jews, but in Cambodia and Rwanda, right, the Yazidis in Iraq and so on. God help us, we already see how ignorant students, even at Harvard and top universities, are of history. They're rewriting what a genocide is by even using the word genocide. It's all over the world, news media, Israel, genocide, genocide, genocide. It is terrible. I'd also say, since Israel is accused of South Africa for apartheid, which of course is also not true, that South Africa is doing a disservice to its own population who were victims of apartheid by rewriting the meaning of apartheid. Modern day South Africans won't understand how much black South Africans suffered under real apartheid. So, and finally, I'd say the Palestinians are also suffering from this, because it makes a resolution that's peace for everyone, including the Palestinians, less likely. This confrontational, ridiculous stance of the world bodies singling out Israel.
Well, you know, the international media seems to have forgotten the word allegations when they make mention of it. Journalism School 101, we will tell you that anything that occurs, it's alleged to have until it's adjudicated. I'll bring the example of the BBC that had to put out apology after apology after apology. Right. The BBC.
Right. Well, it's more than just allegations. I happened to listen to the BBC on the way to the studio this morning, the BBC World Service, which is listened to about 150 million people around the world. We were told, for example, that Israel has been occupying Gaza for 70 years without any rebuttal to such ridiculous, untrue assertion. I would argue further, they shouldn't even say the allegation, because the allegation is without merit. It shouldn't lead the international news. There is a lot else happening in the world. We have 68 countries having democratic elections this year, including Taiwan today. The American primaries are starting in Iowa in a few days. There are conflicts throughout the world, well-known ones like Ukraine, but also lesser ones. And even airing this word, even if it had allegations, they're doing a disservice, not just to Israelis and Palestinians, they're doing a disservice to the people listening to them. And if I could just make one final point, no one's pushing back on things that are just not true. So we're told time and time again that the Palestinian fatalities in Gaza have reached 23,000, without being told that the Hamas, who are making these allegations, have a track record of lying for decades. And we're also not told that, according to Israel, which is more accurate, about 8,500 of those people are Palestinian combatants, which means, if we take Hamas figures, a 2.5 to 1 ratio of combatant to civilian. The average conflict since World War II has been 9 civilians killed for every combatant. Iran and the Iraq War and the Afghan War was about 4 or 5 to 1. So somebody should explain to BBC listeners that even if Hamas figures are accurate, Israel is killing less civilians per combatant than almost any other conflict.
I'm going to have you hold on one second, because in an interview with Andrew Mitchell on MSNBC yesterday, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken was asked about the killing of 2 journalists from Al Jazeera, so-called journalists from Al Jazeera, Hamza al-Dawdou and Mustafa Tureya, by an Israeli airstrike in Gaza. Now, the U.S. Secretary of State Blinken said that he was heartbroken by their death, as, and I'm going to use these quotes now, the worst possible loss. Take a listen.
My heart goes out to him. It goes out to the far too many innocent people who've lost their lives in this conflict. And when it comes to Palestinian men, women, and children, or for that matter, when it comes to journalists.
Here's where I'm going to go to Jacques Neriah for this. That moments later, the IDF came out and showed that these journalists...
These two journalists were, in fact, terrorists. They were on the list of Hamas, and they had even a immatriculation. So, I mean, to claim that these are journalists, this is definitely not true. And then part of being a team of Al Jazeera, if you open Al Jazeera, you really are the spokesman of Hamas. There's no way that there's something objective being aired in the Al Jazeera media at all. It's all the time accusing Israel of killings and of genocide, and this is the line, and this is one shouldn't be surprised that those two who were killed were automatically considered to be not only martyrs but the martyrs of journalism. So this is what it is today, and it's a pity.
Well, the fact that the U.S. Secretary of State legitimized it is an issue.
You should have expected from the Secretary of State to be much more responsible, and before airing such remarks concerning the two journalists, to have checked with the intelligence agencies in the States in order to know that these two were in fact terrorists.
But I think the issue more than anything is that somebody like Andrea Mitchell or someone at MSNBC would turn around and say they don't have that intelligence, right? So they're going to try to push somebody against the corner and say, you see, you have two journalists who were killed. You have the journalist up in Lebanon who was killed. You see, the IDF is targeting journalists, and I imagine, and maybe you can help me with this, is that the Secretary of State felt that he has to answer it somehow. Well,
you know, the IDF is doing all it can in order to explain the situation. Only yesterday, a group of journalists were taken to a tunnel where the hostages were being held in Khan Yunis in order to show them what's going on. In an unprecedented cases, we have seen the IDF during this war asking for journalists to join the active units on the ground in order to see the reality, that all what is claimed is not correct, and this is a big battle that we are waging. Unfortunately, we are fighting prejudice. We are fighting anti-Semitism. We are fighting the people who want the news. I mean, to claim news and without even checking.
This information war is actually important. I want to talk to you about, because yesterday the IDF, actually the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, put out a big booklet where they went through statistics as to the casualties that occurred in Gaza, and they broke it down. I mean, I could have cross-matched it 5 ways through data science as to which way a lot of these horrible cases, 1,200 deaths and murders in October the 7th, plus the hundreds that have been killed since. Hamas hasn't done that, and we don't know how many people have been killed.
Hamas is a specialist, is a chief in forging information. Now, if you take the case of the hospital, of the Ahli hospital, Mahmadani was a minute later they claimed that there were 500 people killed, and then after all the agencies, everybody took that number, of course, in order to attack Israel, say Israel was responsible, and then they realized that it was a misfire of the jihad, the Islamic jihad, and then they just checked the numbers and finally got to the idea, to the number that between 10 and 50 in the parking lot and not on the hospital.
How much of it? Tom, I'm sorry, you wanted to bring a point.
I just want to say vis-a-vis the media, I would recommend honestreporting.com, an NGO, put out a report yesterday with video evidence of journalists working, photojournalists for both Reuters and Associated Press, participating along with Hamas in the October 7th massacre. They didn't kill anyone, but they watched on, they laughed as someone was lynched and so on. That's one thing. Another thing I want to say is people will be forgiven for not knowing this, because the BBC yesterday buried on its website a small clarification about its report, which was aired 6 times on Christmas Eve on both its domestic and world service. That report said that Israel had executed 187 civilians and buried them in unmarked graves in Gaza, in the north of Gaza. This report is completely made up. The BBC admitted they got it from Hamas and should have checked it further. This isn't the first time it's happened, not just in this conflict. I've been covering as a journalist this conflict for decades. In the Second Intifada for example, the so-called Jenin massacre. Again and again and again, the BBC and other so-called respectable, reliable news media just lapped up the worst information against Israel that was fed to them, not just by Hamas, but also by Fatah, the other Palestinian body, and they just repeated it as fact. I mean, this is just...
Do you think that's done? Because there has been access into Gaza, for example? So BBC has a correspondent that's based inside Gaza. Al Jazeera does as well.
They're all Palestinians. They're not reporters coming from outside. They are local Palestinians, and they are just serving the Palestinian cause. I mean, they are just reporting, for instance, that Israel is stealing the bodies from graves. What for? What for?
No, but I mean, I just want to say, the BBC or CNN or whoever, New York Times, they wouldn't believe every word that comes out of Vladimir Putin's mouth. They'd qualify it. They'd say, does this sound right? If the Russian Ministry of Information suddenly said, you know, Ukraine had massacred 5,000 civilians on the outskirts of Moscow, they might say, we haven't verified this. They might not report it at all because it's so preposterous.
But they also do that with Netanyahu when they claim IDF says something. There's always alleged. There's always reportedly. There's still needs to be verified, but it's not the other way around.
They also don't explain that Israel is a functioning democracy with a vigorous media, independent media, and social civil groups. And if Israel carries out some massacre, you can be for sure it will be on Israeli TV news. There'll be condemnations. Haaretz will do special editions, and so on.
Those special groups, I mean, leftists and extremists that would take every opportunity to attack their own state.
Now, Jacques, I want to talk to you a little bit about if you're such a difference. You were a foreign policy advisor to prime ministers in the past. We have gone from, in the 1970s and 80s, the way that Israel had portrayed outside anything like this versus what's happened today. It's a different ballgame completely.
Well, you know, the roles have been reversed, and we are no more David. We are Goliath, and the Palestinians are David. This is basically the thing. I mean, we are a huge state, the most powerful army in the region, and so on and so on. And as such, we are expected to have higher values, and this is why the world is judging us very hard, because they expect from us to be, I mean, the saints almost. Which is in a war like this, and you don't have even the time to think, I mean, about what to do. I mean, because of friendly fire, we have 10% of our troops are being killed. And we are trying to do the utmost. As the Prime Minister said, leaflets are sent. There is no army in the world that does this kind of prevention for not to kill civilians. And we prefer not to hit targets. We hear that the pilots saying there are civilians there, there are kids here. We are not firing. We are not targeting. And this is something that is uncomparable in the world.
Sorry, please.
I would even go further and say that the world has kind of set Israel up. In any other conflict, let's take Ukraine and Russia, for example, within days of Russia invading Ukraine, about 5 to 7 million Ukrainians had sought refuge in Poland and other neighboring states, even though central and western Ukraine were actually quite safe. What would be let's say in the Syrian civil war, 4 million Syrian civilians took refuge in Turkey, 1 million in Lebanon, 2 million in Jordan. What would be
500,000 killed inside
Yes,
Syria.
but what I want to say is this. What would be the reasonable thing if people actually cared about Palestinian civilians is to allow Palestinian civilians to temporarily take refuge in the Sinai just across the border. Qatar, which funds the World Cup and builds a whole metro and masses of stadiums in no time, could easily build perfectly comfortable living quarters for those poor Palestinian civilians. And meantime, Israel and Hamas will fight it out, and then the civilians can move back to Gaza. That's what happens in every other conflict. The world, and I would include the Biden administration, would not let Palestinian civilians get out of harm's way. It therefore becomes inevitable that Hamas, mixing in with civilians, some, unfortunately many too many civilians, have died or been injured. But their blood is not just on Hamas's hands, it's on the world's hands for applying different rules to this conflict than any other conflict on earth.
But then look at the hundreds who are taking to the streets of New York, blocking all of Manhattan or Paris or London. That doesn't fit in that narrative.
Yeah, but they shout free Palestine. They don't even know what is Palestine. I mean, the free Palestine from the sea to the river. I mean, and exterminate Israel. Israel does not exist. Free Palestine. What do you mean free Palestine? Are we occupying the Gaza? Since 1993, we have left Gaza. In 2005, we have totally left Gaza. So we don't have any inch of Gaza inside Israel.
Jacques, just to show you a point, there's a video going around social media that I watched of a young Israeli woman who went in front of these protesters in New York with the "Bring Them Home Now" T-shirt, and she put out an Israeli flag, and they assaulted her. And all she was saying is, "What about my family that's being held hostage? What about my family members who are there?" There was such venom against her. I mean, it wasn't even respectful venom. It was ridiculously disrespectful.
Yeah, well, you know, this is the rebirth of anti-Semitism, and it has been latent all the time, and now it's up.
I mean, you know, after the Holocaust, some wishful thinking that anti-Semitism would just disappear after being prevalent for 2,000 years in Europe and beyond. Where do people think it all went? It's just been waiting there. And I don't just blame these idiotic protesters in Manhattan or Los Angeles or London or Paris. I blame their educators at elite universities. I blame the media for lying to them, for encouraging them.
So doesn't today give them ammunition today, or not even ammunition, gives them evidence, credence for if they're going to see the stuff that's going to be shown in The Hague, they're going to say, you see, there it is.
The court won't rule on this genocide accusation apparently for years. So of course, just the broadcast is enough to whip people up. I mean, look, if I didn't know what was happening and I was told that somebody was committing genocide against someone else, I would also take to the streets in protest. I mean, it's a natural reaction. They're being whipped up by the big lie.
We haven't seen anybody accusing Syria at the ICJ. The ICJ. He killed 500,000 of his own people. Where are the Chinese with the Uyghurs? And where are the Burmese with the
Rohingya Muslims?
So I mean,
no, they don't. It's all about bashing Israel. If they cared about Muslims, as Jacques just pointed out, they are serious genocidal intent towards the Uyghur by China, Burma, Rohingya, so on. Yes.
Tom Gross and Jacques Neriah, thank you so much for joining us.